All right, open question. Do political parties matter? Does the Republican Party specifically matter? Not Republican politicians or Republican voters or the Republican nominee for president, but the party as an organization. Specifically, does the Republican Party matter in the states? I think it is an open question and a really interesting one. Every 4 years, we think for a second that what happens in the states matters, right? Because of the presidential primary system. But once each party has a nominee, we tend to ignore the states again until the next time people from faraway places start parking their buses in the parking lot of Ross's restaurant and ordering Magic Mountains like they're old Iowans from way back. But while the Republican Party has chosen its nominee for president this year, and the press corps has forgotten again about the states, something really interesting has been happening in the states. We've talked before about how even after Mitt Romney locked up the nomination, Ron Paul has continued winning the majority of delegates in a bunch of states. Just last weekend, Ron Paul won most of the delegates in Iowa, to go with his wins in Nevada and in Maine and in Minnesota and maybe Louisiana once Louisiana figures it out. Republicans in Idaho and Oregon are holding their conventions this week, and the Ron Paul folks say they are trying for a couple more wins in those states. You're going to see a lot of Ron Paul delegates at that Republican convention this summer that's supposed to be an all-in thing for Mitt Romney. And now more than 100 of those delegates are suing the Republican Party, they say, to be allowed to vote their conscience, to be allowed to show up at the Mitt Romney coronation and cast dissenting votes that count, that are actually binding votes that count against Mitt Romney's nomination. But here's the other thing that's going on, again, with basically zero Beltway attention in the states. Ron Paul loyalists are not just winning the majority of delegates in some of these states since Romney clinched the nomination. They are also taking over the Republican Party itself as an organization. A Ron Paul loyalist is now the chairman of the party in Iowa. So is the organizer who watches over the party's presence in Iowa's counties, which is something that really matters in Iowa. Ron Paul folks have taken over the party in Alaska, electing a Ron Paul supporter as their new chairman. Ron Paul folks have taken over the county party in Nevada, where 3/4 of the state's population resides, the Las Vegas part of Nevada. They also replaced Nevada's 2 members of the Republican National Committee. They voted down the Mitt Romney supporters and picked Ron Paul supporters instead. In Maine, Ron Paul loyalists took over the state convention, electing a new Republican National Committee woman and taking over dozens of seats on the state committee. And so I ask again, does the party matter? Does the Republican Party matter in the states? Because now that the Ron Paul revolution has overthrown the Republican Party in at least 4 states and taken over at least portions of the party in half a dozen states and counting, you know what they're doing with their new power? They're changing what those state Republican parties do. So if it does matter what Republican parties do, you should know they are about to start doing something different. Exhibit A, Virginia, where Ron Paul supporters have won a lot of new spots on the Republican State Committee this year. Last week, the newly Ron Paul populated committee voted to change the way the state picks nominees for top Virginia offices, like, say, governor. They used to pick the Republican Virginia nominees by holding a primary. Now they're going to pick them at the Republican State Convention starting next year. Now, by their nature, party conventions tend to attract the hardliners and the hardcore, right? You got to show up. You got to sit through a lot of speeches. Sometimes it goes on for days. It's always really boring. Back in 2010, hardliners in Utah were able to oust the relatively moderate Republican Senator Bob Bennett at the state convention. At this year's convention, hardliners forced Utah's other Republican Senator, Orrin Hatch, into a primary. Consider also the otherwise staid and seersucker world of Connecticut Republican politics, where twice now, wrestling executive Linda McMahon has emerged from conventions with the party's endorsement for Senate, despite pleas from the party leadership to please choose someone more moderate. And so again, I ask whether the many state Republican parties matter. Does it matter what those parties do? And what does it mean that the Republican Party establishment in important states is losing control of what those parties do now? Joining us now is someone who knows, Nicole Wallace, former communications director for the Bush administration, senior advisor for the McCain-Palin campaign, and importantly, the author of It's Classified, a novel that just came out in paperback, a novel that I found very enjoyable and I think you should read. Nicole, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So you have, this is not, I don't want to have a partisan discussion about right and wrong here. I'm interested in the tactics here. Running campaigns that have to work through the parties. You got to count on the party for something, right?
Sure.
Even at a at the national level. Is the stuff that the parties are responsible for doing, is that stuff that somebody else could do it if the party decided they didn't want to?
Well, I mean, you spend a lot of time here talking about the consequences of our changed campaign finance laws, and there certainly are state party functions that could be. I mean, some of the most important things. One of my first jobs in politics was for the California Republican Party, and I'll forever be grateful to the California Republican Party for giving me one of my first jobs in politics. I couldn't tell you now. What you described about Congressman Paul's folks going in, I think you first have to answer the question that you laid out there at the end. Do the state parties matter before you can answer the second? And what are the consequences of Paul's supporters going in and taking them over? Because if the answer to the first is no, then the answer to the second
What is the answer to the first? I mean, do state parties do something important?
Well, historically, they always have. First of all, they put our politics at a much more accessible level than our national parties. Not everyone can go to a national convention, but a state convention is much more accessible. And, we tend to look at politics and politicians in a cynical way for justifiable reasons. But a lot of people get involved in politics at a pure community and civic interest and engagement. And so you can't discourage those people or suggest that the state party is no longer going to be an outlet for their enthusiasm or their activism, because that has forever been the most important reason for the state parties to be strong and vital.
So you can't suggest that it's not going to be consequential. Sure, come along and play, but it doesn't matter what we do here because we're going to get overridden by the people in Washington who think we're crazies.
Well, and you can't I think, understate the peril to doing away with the state parties. I mean, they have historically been the place where grassroots activists go to begin to learn. It's where political professionals go and have some of their first jobs. And you learn how to knock on doors and turn out bodies to go to voting booths and vote, because in this country, that's still how we vote. Mm-hmm. And so there's something so fundamental to understanding what a state party does, to understanding and appreciating and knowing how to function and thrive in our democracy. If you're a political professional, you have to understand that people don't have to vote. They have to be inspired to get out and go vote. So just understanding sort of the mechanics and the structural way to motivate voters to vote for a candidate in a congressional district and how that. So I think the consequences of the state parties going away are tragic.
Well, they're not going away, though. What they're doing is they're going insurgent. I mean, the Clark County, Nevada Republican Party, right, is supporting Ron Paul and overtly not supporting Mitt Romney, right? There was somebody from the executive board at that county Republican Party, which again is 3/4 of the population in Nevada, put up a billboard deriding Mitt Romney as the second coming of George W. Bush. I'm sure that's offensive to you. That's not what I mean. And saying that Ron Paul is actually the second coming of Ronald Reagan. There's the billboard. I mean, that is not what you can't look to those folks and say, okay, help us elect Mitt Romney. So what does the Romney campaign do? How do they try to win Nevada?
Well, look, I think they have to have a thick skin about it, and it appears that they have. And I think that you have to appreciate that in a democracy, and we don't live in a dictatorship where everyone has to fall in line. And certainly, 4 years ago, the most dramatic. Well, but 4 years ago, the most dramatic convention that I'd seen in a long time, and I've been to a lot. I've been to both parties' national conventions for the last 2 cycles. The Hillary people, there was a lot of drama there. What are they going to do at the convention? Are they and just because you
but there were no Hillary Clinton coups in the states, right? No, there was no Hillary Clinton.
That's right. They didn't take over any state parties, but this opportunity or appetite to take over a state party is glorious. I mean, how great! They cared the most, they worked the hardest, and they took over a few state parties. We'll see if it has the consequences of derailing Mitt Romney's chances in those states. But the fact that we can still do that, and I can't imagine they did that with a lot of money, they're activists. And one thing about Paul's supporters is they're true believers. No one pays them to go and do anything. So if they were able to take over the state party, good for them. I think that the fact that Barack Obama and Mitt Romney are going to be there probably every day until Election Day is going to overtake the story about the state parties as the bigger and more interesting.
But watching what they're able to do with what what they got.
It's amazing.
I think is interesting.
Good for them, right?
See, we're on the same page again. Beware, America. It just happened
Multi-democracy, right?
Exactly. Enthusiasm for people being into it.
Right.
I'm with you on that. Nicole Wallace, of course, was a senior advisor to McCain Palin as a former communications director for the aforementioned George W. Bush. But listen, It's Classified is just out in paperback, and that's very important because that makes it very light to carry, and it is a perfect beach read, and it's really amusing.
Thank you.
Nicole, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be right back.